Welcome to Step Away from the Table, Beyond the Table. The podcast for pet groomers ready to start their next chapter. Let's explore what's possible when you trade in the grooming table for the freedom of virtual work. Whether you're done with the physical toll or just craving more flexibility, you're in the right place. We're staying in the pet industry, just shifting how we show up. So take a breath, step away from the table, and let's see what's waiting for you on the other side.
Hey everyone, it's River from The Savvy Groomer, as well as Step Away from the Table with my co-host, Jess from Groomer Support Services. Whoop whoop. And we are here recording our podcast, Step Away from the Table, Beyond the Table. Woo. Right? And what's wonderful about this podcast is these are for the people that have stepped away from the table and now they're looking to explore beyond it. But the fun thing about today is that we're actually going to be looking at it from the grooming business owner side, or what we like to call the supervisor side, right? And we're going to talk about, sorry, my cat literally sat on my lap as I'm doing this intro. For those of you guys, we love fire. He's here with us. We're going to be talking about why a grooming VA is an asset to your business. And really quickly, a little shout out to my other business, Groomer Gifts. I love my Where's Cooper shirt, and I feel like this is a perfect short shirt to talk about why VAs can really help your grooming business. So, first things first, let's talk about how groomer VAs know our lingo. They know how to communicate for these things. So, just I would love your perspective, obviously, because you're actively doing this work right now. Do you find that grooming business owners, which we're going to call supervisors for sanity's sake,
Yeah.
do they find a lot of relief that you can take over these things, but you know how to communicate with them as a groomer?
Hello, and yes. With my particular way of operating, I always have a really connected onboarding process, and that particularly just involves communication with the supervisor, understanding what their preferences, what they are looking for from me. Because in the way that I work, I'm somewhat general in the tasks that I do, primarily back end, as you may or may not know. I am a systems specialist, but really, I tailor my services to how I can help the groomers. So already the baseline foundation of my knowledge is deep in understanding groomers, how they work, the lingo, descriptions to dog breeds, energy level it takes to groom particular dogs, down to understanding and sometimes collaborating to create for the very first time their service agreements. I need to know their exceptions and how they want to run day to day. So, with all of that coming out of onboarding and still in communication day to day, I really feel like we have a good flow together. We understand each other. They look to me for support, not only in just the ways that we've outlined, but also just like, hey, from a groomer to groomer, how do you feel about this? Or like, I don't have the energy to deal with this client right now. Can you please reach out? And I'm like, yeah, no problem. I got this. It creates a nice medium buffer between the supervisor and myself. Or is that correct? Yeah, because I'm dealing with clients, like what is draining them? And that's really what I'm here to do.
I love that. And I think what's really important too is that if you are working with, there's nothing wrong, guys, with, because we're talking to our business owners, our supervisors in this podcast. I want to say there's nothing wrong with you hiring a virtual assistant from the Philippines who has no grooming knowledge. There's nothing wrong with that inherently.
Mhm.
But I will tell you that when that person has booked you three back-to-back Great Pyrenees, right? Once a year, Great Pyrenees, or they've only booked you 20 minutes for a once a year pug whose nails are literally growing into their pads. They're not going to understand what you need as a groomer because again, we've worked on these breeds, we understand the nuance as well as explaining, I definitely think you need a Rosetta Stone for, and we do need to simplify, right? However you've chosen to have your grooming notes, right? We definitely need to standardize that. But again, if I handed you just, and you and I have never groomed together, if I handed you those old-fashioned index cards, I know some of you guys have them. If I handed you
Cringe.
a card, right? But if I handed it for you for a standard poodle, you could probably mostly decipher what I'm writing.
Mhm.
And I think what's important is that when if you're a supervisor, right, you're like, I don't know if it's worth hiring somebody who's going to cost me more, who has a grooming background. One thing okay, so Jess, I don't know if have you heard the little Dutch boy story before?
Mm-mm.
This is
No,
my
no,
favorite.
no.
Okay. So this is a story I like to tell at trade shows. So I had a customer, a pet grooming customer who had this adorable little, I think he was a cockapoo, and he was very sweet, nice little dog. And she told me she wanted him to look like a little Dutch boy. Now, let me tell you, I tried everything to figure out what this woman meant. I had no idea. I asked her for photos, and she literally brought me photos of like a painting, like like a shepherd. And I was, because at first, I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, she wants his ears level with the chin, like that kind of bob. No, that was not it. I'm like, okay, well, maybe she wants this. Maybe. And every single time she's like, no, 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 no. More like a little Dutch boy. And I'm like, this has got to be like next level trolling or something. I tried for a very long time to figure that out. And what I feel like is, again, as a groomer who is a good communicator to a customer, at least I have a dog in for me, I can communicate that. What I think what's tough when we're groomers is that we have to remember that then not only do we have to communicate with customers who don't know what our services are, but also if
Mhm.
we have a VA who's never been in a salon,
Mhm.
we have two people who have never stepped foot in our industry. And I think that makes everything more difficult. This is one of my favorite stories because if you had a virtual assistant who you've hired who is communicating with the customer who wants a little
Mhm.
Dutch boy, they're going to look at
Mhm.
you, the groomer, and say, well, don't you know what this is? And you're going to be like, it's not a thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And I mean, it's the same thing with, short, not shaved, and
Mhm.
a
Teddy
puppy.
bear fake. Or yeah. 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 And I try and make an effort personally to communicate with the owners before. So part of my onboarding, this is just a
But
very
when you
specific
say owner,
example.
do you mean
Mhm.
the supervisor? Sorry to
Pet
cut
pet groomer, pet groomer owner. I do a lot of client communication within my work. So often they've handed me the phones in a way that's done through software programs. Okay. So I'm working on software. I'm texting clients and I have purposely created intake forms because I want things streamlined and efficient. I like systems, right? If you're going to pay me to do work, I want it to be the most efficient way possible so that you're saving money, right? And in my intake forms for pet groomers, parents, I asked specific questions that would indicate red flags. I asked them specifically, what kind of haircut are you looking for? Why are you leaving your previous groomer? Or what have you looking for a new groomer? When was your last professional grooming? All this information informs me a little bit, and I relay that to the groomer who will be doing that dog that day. And I will follow up sometimes in specific instances, like selecting a haircut on a double coated breed when I know that the supervisor has specifically said their salon mobile does not shave double breeds. I've caught that. I've explained to them. I've talked about puppy grooms, all these things. So yes, like I remember working for my first grooming salon where the receptionist was a young kid, 16 years old, no grooming experience. And boy, as a new groomer learning, and having scheduled like the worst scheduling ever, it was so difficult. I almost like turned around and ran from there. And it was really because of, you know, bad receptionist. No offense. We love receptionists, but not all are created equal. And are they necessary? Is what I propose
Well, and
sometimes.
I think that again, I that's a whole thing I'd love to talk
Yeah, it
about.
is.
Um, Actually, let's write that down. Our receptionist, necessary.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I agree. And I think it's funny because the same groomer that the supervisor, right? You guys listening, the same people that will ask me, you know, do I need to hire a virtual assistant with relevant grooming experience? I will ask you, when you worked for a grooming salon or a vet clinic with a receptionist who had no grooming, maybe they have lots of dog experience, but they have no grooming experience, and they've never worked in a grooming salon, or never worked in a mobile unit. How was that? Was that fun? It was never fun for me because,
Hmm.
I mean, it was always making weird, what I felt like were obvious mistakes, like again, booking once a year dogs. And they're like, oh, this shouldn't be that big of a deal. It's just a pug. And I'm like, yeah, but that pug hasn't been in a year. And if you look at the grooming notes, he's already bad for his nails. And if we write that he's bad for his nails and he's a pug, which we assume is already bad for his nails, then we know this dog is a two-dog person. I mean, a two-person dog. We know all of these things. Or if I ask that same supervisor, right, you guys listening in, if I asked you, how fun was it to work for somebody who has no, um, let's say for easy math, right? If you have somebody who has no grooming experience and they've bought out the business, are you like, oh, no big deal, right? I can explain to them what I do, or are you anxious? I think those are the same reasons why investing in a virtual assistant with grooming experience. And do
Hmm.
they all need to have experience? No, but it makes it run so much smoother. And I think it's worth all of it, right? Again, if I say to Jess, I want a five all over, she
Hmm.
can ask me questions to do that. But the average person who's just a pet owner wouldn't. If I said to you, hey, Jess, I have a standard poodle, say for easy, I want a five all over. What are
Hmm.
some quick things as a groomer you might ask me as to the customer, right? You might
Hmm.
say, for instance, like what customization would you question that customer?
About a five all over on a poodle?
Yep. If I said, oh, I think he gets a five all over. You're my
Hmm.
receptionist. You would ask, let's say, two questions that you would ask for clarification. One is,
Are we are we talking groomer length? How short? And I would try and describe that length. Are we getting poodle feet, poodle face,
right,
the other aspects of the standard poodle groom, which are crucial, right? Or are we doing just all over short, which is very different,
right.
very different.
Exactly. And so if I'm just a receptionist who is just inputting notes, right? They're just going to put in five all over. But
Mhm.
us as in the industry, we're going to say, okay, but did that poodle, it like literally nose to tail a five all over, or did you do clean
Mhm.
feet, clean face? Did you, and they'd be like, oh no, I did a clean feet, clean face, right? And then I'm going to say, was
Mhm.
it a 10, a 15, or a 30?
And without clarification on these points, you go two routes, I think. You call up the owner and get clarification, which is taking away time from your work, which time is money in our industry. Or two, you just follow as it says, and you could potentially be putting some real disappointment and losing a customer for the business. Um, this is another point about groomer VAs assisting supervisors, grooming business owners, is we understand your lingo and your pace and what goes on day to day and how it can be chaotic. Nothing is perfect, but we can really branch the connection between your staff, between the supervisor and potentially a non-groomer business owner. There's it's just this middleman that's actually helpful and connective, I think. It's very special.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point too, is that a lot of you guys that are groomers and maybe not grooming business owners,
Hmm.
you actually might be more willing to work for a grooming salon if the owner, let's say, maybe isn't a groomer and has no background, but they hire a specialist like Jess, who's going to come in and make sure that things are fair, that things are done properly, and that a groomer is well taken care of. And so I think that's a great point where if you're needing somebody, or maybe you're going from a salon staff of 10 or 15 people and you're going to branch out into mobile. I think a lot of supervisors who, for better or for worse, they've owned a grooming business that has a salon and they think they can just slide into mobile and they don't realize a lot of the pitfalls. So hiring somebody who's either ideally a VA who's specializing in mobile grooming or
Mhm.
again has been in. You don't know what you don't know. And I think that's why a VA for the grooming industry is a game changer.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
So really quickly,
Mhm.
it was so interesting when I was talking to people about cost, and I think we should do a whole podcast on cost. But
Yeah.
and we don't have to get into exact numbers, but
Mhm.
I think it was really interesting when we were talking about the different um, costs of things. And one thing someone said is like, "Oh, well, I can hire a VA from the Philippines for, I mean, sometimes as low as $3 to $5 per hour, right?"
Mhm.
But if I were to hire a virtual assistant for the grooming industry, it's going to be significantly more. To
Mhm.
me, like you said, you used a great example where you talked about where they have to contact the customer, right? Because you can call if you see on the info sheet when you're calling a customer, the
Mhm.
group wrote just five all over.
Mhm.
If they also uploaded a photo, you
Mhm.
can look at that photo and say, okay, say clean feet, clean face, and you can write that down. And then
Mhm.
because you know the breed.
Mhm.
And then also if it has a top knot, maybe you don't gauge it, but you'd be more, that communication I feel like would be more fast. Have you ever had a situation where someone has either hired a non-VA for the industry or has tried to use a VA? I have some examples of people outside the industry
Mhm.
that were more cost effective technically, but they weren't in the long term.
I would let you speak on that specific. I really can only speak upon people often come to me with questions of like, should I hire a receptionist over you? And you brought up the point about cost, and I just want to say, when you have a receptionist, they're usually a W-2 employee. You have to pay taxes on them, an hourly rate, which maybe they're not being efficient during that time. With a VA, I myself and I advocate all VAs out there to charge hourly monthly packages. So you've paid for 10, 15, 20, 25, etc. hours of my time per month. I'm being extremely efficient with that time. And I am, in the long run, a lot cheaper than a receptionist. But I've never been compared to or been hired against a general VA. So I'd love for you to speak on that if you have examples.
I do, but really quickly, I want to add in, I
Mhm.
totally agree with the packages and whether those packages are based on hourly or they're based on projects. It really wildly depends upon what services you're doing, but I
Mhm.
100% agree. And absolutely, that VA that knows the industry, they're going to be so much more efficient. And there's nothing wrong with having someone in the building, but I think there's this fantasy of this receptionist is also going to be bathing. They're also going to be doing this, also going to do that. They're probably not. They're really, I mean, I'm not saying anything bad about the younger generations, but we're in a world that's less work focused.
Mhm.
And I don't know about you, Jess, with your age range. When I was leaving high school and I was in college, we had the economic downturn. And so jobs were more competitive and they still thought we were lazy, but
Mhm.
we still had that workaholic, right? The girl boss generation is not the current generation you're going to be hiring for an in-person receptionist. They're not. They're going to come
Mhm.
in, they're going to do their job. Um, and I hate to break it to you guys, but for the most part, the wages that you could offer an in-person receptionist, they're not going to be able to stay with you long term. You're not going to be able to pay them enough for them to stay long term because they can't buy a house, right? They can't live on their own. And with the
Mhm.
rising cost, I mean, $100,000 at this point is unfortunately minimum wage. Like it's not minimum wage, but it's the minimum lifestyle that the majority of the country is looking at.
Mhm.
And so that's a whole different conversation, but that's something to remember. And if they're with you 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, you are their only source of income versus a virtual assistant. They can have many streams of income and they can organize all of that. And
Yeah.
again, if it doesn't work out, you're not firing someone, you're not putting their life and their family at risk. So if you have a virtual assistant, it's not working out, there's also not that level of guilt. So,
And I think there's just a shift overall in how we can structure our grooming business to be effective and good communication. I think that's an old model, to a certain extent. I don't want groomers stopping and coming and acting as receptionists, right? But there's got to be something in process, like smart systems in place to make that work,
absolutely.
hacking the systems.
I could not agree more. And I do think we should really spend like a whole podcast talking about receptionist versus virtual assistant, but I'm going to put that in a
Mhm.
little box for now. Uh,
Yep.
I know it's like, this would be so good. That's why we have this new podcast, so we can talk about all the good things.
Yeah.
Yay. But as far as like people hiring these, I keep using the Philippines, and I love that part of the world. I love Southeast Asia. I love Thailand. I love Indonesia. I love Malaysia. Um, Malaysia, they actually do speak English. So, these are in the Philippines, a lot of times they speak a lot of English. That said, it's very different culturally. Um, and even compared to like the US versus Australia versus England, there's a lot of cultural differences in general. And that's really important when you have somebody who's going to be taking over the customer support of your business. Nobody likes calling into a foreign telemarketer situation, right? When I call into the bank, it's not that I have anything against different people in other countries, but there can be language barriers. There can be situations where there's cultural differences, where someone is accidentally insulting me. Um, on the flip side, I may accidentally trigger them, and now they're not going to be as helpful as they would have been. Um, I think if you're going to go that route as a supervisor, as a growing business owner, I think that you're going to have to accept the limitations of that. And I don't think they're going to be as helpful as you hope. Because again, if you have somebody who is in a totally different culture and who's in a different part of the world, right? And for instance, I have a situation where somebody had hired somebody specifically from the Philippines, and they were super nice and friendly and warm and wonderful. But then something happened where they had nicked a dog, and the supervisor had them call and explain the situation, and they weren't necessarily dismissive, but it's just a different culture. For us, our pets are our kids. And it's just it's so much deeper.
Mhm.
And the idea that someone is going to go to the vet office and spend thousands of dollars on a dog is just a different experience. And so that person made it much worse for that supervisor. Now, could that happen with an American or Australian or UK? Absolutely. But if you have somebody who's been in a salon, they're not going to be dismissive when a dog is cut. They're not going to be accidentally offensive because they've been in those situations or they've heard of that situation and they know what they would do in that situation. And I think that's really important if you're going to have them do things like that. Um, Again, there's nothing wrong. I love all of these places, but I remember explaining that I worked in the pet industry, and a lot of these places, that's such a foreign concept. Because don't forget, a lot of these places are just, I mean, they're just totally, I mean, even when you think you can understand how different they are, it's just not fair to judge them. It's not, there's nothing wrong with the
Mhm.
way that they view the world.
Mhm.
But we
And
have,
even if, sorry,
yeah, no, no, please.
even if there's a non front facing role like client communication from a VA that's not in the industry, I think anything involving copy, and I'm thinking specifically
Hmm.
uh, websites wholly because there's various components within website making. But I mean, how many websites have we looked at where the picture that's lined up with the words like doesn't make sense, um, or the copy meaning like the written text that goes along with whatever picture on social media is just like doesn't quite make sense either. You know what I mean? You just have to have perspective and understanding to a certain degree. If you have no knowledge, it could really kind of miss the mark.
I would say that expands to both to pet grooming, if
Hmm.
you're having a virtual assistant who's not even in the pet industry, but they're still from our country, right? You could
Hmm.
still have those copy issues, whether
Hmm.
that's in your social media or marketing, as well as understanding what customers want, right? We deal with the dogs every day.
Hmm.
And but I agree 1000%. Um, and there's instances where there's deeper meaning to things, or the cultural context of things has never been more apparent to me than the more I travel. Because things that have weight in them may not in America versus, going to Japan. There were things that I didn't understand why doing things was accidentally offensive to
Hmm.
people,
Yeah.
which you learn. And again, it's a lot easier to just have somebody who's here that you don't have to explain those things to,
Hmm.
and I
And
know
that
it's silly, but it's true.
No, and that brings into the broader topic of like protecting your time and energy, which is something I think groomer VAs bring to the table that is understated maybe because we understand and some things are unspoken and the learning curve is lower. Lower? Yeah, but you know what I mean. Um, we're here for you, right? And we want to make sure that we are taking things off your plate that don't serve you, that are giving you more time with your friends, your family, your life, um, taking away jobs that drain, jobs within the business that you run, that really suck up your energy. Like that I think is the main role. And so to like not have to write a detailed, SOP, standard operating procedure manual, like, hey, VA that isn't a groomer, here's all the things I want you to do. That takes time and energy to make. And if you don't do that, you're going to be like cleaning up their work a lot. That's just my thought. I think that's a huge topic that we could talk about down the
That
road, but
we could totally talk about that. And that actually really quickly reminded me of a great story. Another speaker had told me she was teaching a cat grooming class in Russia and she had an interpreter. And the interpreter was not of grooming. And so she taught this whole class. The entire time, people looked very confused, extraordinarily confused. And she was like, what's going on? And she would ask them, through the interpreter, and they would be like, no, I guess that makes sense. And the biggest thing is the word for clipper. Instead of using a shaving clipper, he thought she meant a nail clipper.
oh.
So imagine having this entire thing. And she's explaining that basically we're using nail clippers to shave cats and do everything like that. And again, nobody waited. Again, that whole class would have been better if someone had mentioned it, but at the same time, how would they even know to ask, right? Because to them, this was a new thing, and they're like, oh, maybe this is the tool that they use, and who am I to mention it? I mean, imagine having somebody writing your copy and they are using the words, essentially, they're assuming that you're using nail clippers. And even then, if I say to you, Jess, nail clippers, you are not thinking about the ones for people.
Mhm.
And a lot of people that are not in the industry don't know that dog nail clippers look nothing and work nothing like that, right?
Yeah, that's so funny. I just told my grandma last week, oh, I'm driving to a nail trim. And I'm like, you're thinking I mean people, don't you? Or like, she's like, yeah, like you're getting your nails done. I'm like, oh
Right.
God. So
Ex-
simple. But, just whoop. Yeah.
Exactly. And especially if again, like grandparents are a great example. My grandparents were not pet people in the same way that I am. Like they had dogs, but they were basically furniture that ate. So again, like this level of care and confidence, again, a VA who specializes, let's say in the beauty industry, she may or may not have the same level of compassion or care. I'm not saying she wouldn't, but she may not that we would in this industry. But I love that. I love all of that. And I think that's amazing. And protecting your time and energy, I think, is numero uno, right? You really have to do that. And I think this is a really easy way of doing it. And again, like I said, with somebody who may or may not be as compassionate, there's nothing wrong with that. They're not bad people, but that would suck the life out of me. Having somebody who I'm asking to do tasks who doesn't deeply feel the things that I feel for pets. I don't want to spend time with, like outside of work with those people, and having to work within the industry with those people maybe who don't have that level of compassion. So hiring someone who's been a groomer, you don't last in this industry if you don't like pets and you don't have a high level of compassion and empathy for creatures that can't defend themselves.
Yeah, totally.
So is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap this up? Because I feel really good. I think we did a lot. So for you supervisors
Yeah,
who are thinking about it, I think you should take the jump. I think you should hire a VA for the grooming industry.
yeah, and continue to listen to our podcast. We have so much more material and go in depth in different directions of what else VAs offer. Groomer VAs.
Well, that's it. And we're hoping to teach you guys, like, so every time we have a perspective and who this podcast is for, you can always listen to all of them. And I think it's important, but we want to make sure that we're talking to who we're talking, because we understand that, people that are just thinking about coming into the industry, people that are in the industry, or people that are thinking about hiring a VA for the grooming industry are going to have different perspectives and have different questions. So we want to be able to answer them the best that we can.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Well, this is River Lee from the Savvy Groomer and Step Away from the Table with my wonderful co-host, Jess from Groomer Support Systems.
Hey guys.
Yes. And this was why a VA is an asset in your grooming business. And I really suggest, if you haven't already, check out Jess's Groomer Support Services and be able to let her take a look in your system and see if she can help you. And if not her, I'm sure she has other resources for other VAs in the grooming industry who she can point to that can help you out.
Absolutely.
So exciting. All right, guys. So as always, happy grooming.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining me on Step Away from the Table, Beyond the Table. If today's episode sparked something in you, don't forget to follow, share, or leave a review. It helps more groomers like you find their next step. You don't have to do this alone, but you get to do it your way. Until next time, take a deep breath and keep moving forward.